script.
Okay.
Are we live? Are we live?
You should be live.
Oh, darn, I couldn't tell. I'm sorry. Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Shaughnessy, and I serve as chair of the Professional Counselor Advisory Committee for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Good morning. Harriet Buckner.
Here.
Good morning. Melissa Briggs. I don't see her.
I don't see her on the call.
Michael Countryman.
Here.
Morning.
Morning.
Acha Goris.
Present.
Good morning. Michelle
Thank you.
Fairbank.
Good morning, Michelle.
Morning.
Present.
Bob Kircher.
Here.
Morning. Vanessa
Morning.
Perez.
Present.
Morning. Andrew Secor.
I do not see Andrew Secor on the call right now.
Don't see him. And then Adil Torres, he said that he would probably not be here and we don't see him.
Correct.
Okay. I note the following BSRB staff are also present. Leslie. Hi, Leslie. Ellen. Morning. Hello,
morning.
David. I know you're here.
Hello.
Okay. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Laura. And also, I checked the conference call line before we began. There is one individual from the public, Jamal Robinson, who is in attendance today as well.
Thank you.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting to ensure the committee has enough time to get through all the items on the agenda. And Andrew Secor just entered the conference call line or the Zoom meeting as well. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. On January 10th, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And Laura, you are currently muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you. The meeting is now called to order and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda, which is agenda approval. Does anybody have any questions or feedback about the agenda? And the only thing I had was our next meeting is the date is inaccurate, but that can be changed easily. Anybody have anything else for the agenda?
Move to approve.
Thank you, Jim. I need a second.
Second.
Great, thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, the agenda is approved. Now we need a review and approval of the minutes from the last meeting that was December 8th. Anybody have any questions about those meeting notes? I did not have anything when I looked through them.
Motion to approve.
Thank you, Jim.
Seconded.
Thank you. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Okay. The minutes from the last meeting will pass. Okay, Executive Director's Report, David Fye.
Thank you, Laura. And on those approved minutes, we'll make sure that change in date is reflected, that the next meeting date is April 3rd, 2023. So,
Thank you.
committee usually meets the first Monday of those months where held those meetings. I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update to all of you on recent activities by the board and also some legislative updates as well. So the board did have 2 meetings in January. There was the regular full meeting that happened on January 6th, 2023, and also a brief follow-up meeting by the board on January 18th, 2023. At the board meeting on January 6th, one item the board did was discuss the professional counseling compact and any position the board might want to take should that language be introduced before the 2023 legislature. And the board discussed the compact and voted to support the counseling compact if it was introduced in legislation. And so if a bill hearing occurs before the legislature, I'll be providing testimony on behalf of the BSRB in support of the counseling compact. Additionally, the BSRB recently changed legal counsel. We have been receiving services from the Attorney General's office. However, members of that staff, they've had a significant amount of turnover recently, and we are transitioning to different legal staff. In January, the board approved an MOU to receive legal services through the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services for the remainder of 2023. So that agreement is in place, and during that time period that will go until the end of June, we will also be receiving some legal services from Kearney and Associates to avoid any kind of conflict of interest. And then throughout this spring, we'll be looking at other options for the board for both board counsel and disciplinary counsel. Additionally, the board between the 2 meetings, the one on January 6th and January 18th, the board recommended requesting statutory language on a number of items, and I'll just run through those major items that will be included in a bill from the BSRB before the 2023 legislature. The first, with that the board voted to change the reciprocity statutes for most of the professions to lower the number of years of practice in another jurisdiction from 48 of 54 months to 12 months. Second, to create a new type of temporary license for graduates from social work programs that are in candidacy for accreditation by that national accrediting body, the Council of Social Work Education, CSWE. Those would be for bachelor's level and master's level graduates of those programs. And the way that would work is that any individuals who graduate from programs that are in candidacy for accreditation, should that bill pass, they would be able to get a temporary license to practice. And then if their program reached full accreditation, then they would be able to get a permanent license. It's based on a model that's currently being used in Minnesota and has been very successful. So the next item is the board recommended creating a new type of addiction counseling student temporary license, and that is for individuals seeking to obtain necessary coursework for a permanent addiction counseling license. It is similar to the previous counselor in training type license, which operated back when SRS existed. The next item the board was supportive of requesting statutory language is increasing the time period for temporary licenses from 1 year to 2 years, which also lengthens the amount of time that individuals will be able to work under a temporary license while taking license examinations. Some of the temporary licenses are already 2 years, but most of them are 1 year. The board also voted to recommend creating a new pathway for individuals to request more time to complete continuing education hours, which will allow current licensees to continue to renew their licenses if they have not completed all of their hours, and they can show that there are extenuating circumstances for why they would need additional time. They can submit items to the board for review and consideration of being granted additional time. The next item was something the board was working on in order to assist with workforce by assisting those individuals who previously were licensed to be able to reenter the profession. And that statutory language would decrease the license reinstatement fee for individuals seeking to reenter the workforce if their license had been expired for at least 1 year, and it would create and offer a new 6-month reinstatement temporary license for individuals who had not obtained the necessary continuing education hours to have their license fully reinstated. So if they did have all of their hours and they wish to have their license fully reinstated, they would be able to do it just like normal and have their license reinstated. But for individuals who are interested in coming back, they have to have obtained all of the continuing education for the prior time period. This would create a new type of temporary license they could request, which would last no longer than 6 months, allow them to work while they're getting those hours necessary to fully have their license reinstated. Additionally, the board voted to add language to the bill to require board-approved supervisors for social work profession. Currently, there are board-approved supervisors for professional counseling and marriage and family therapy. The board also voted to recommend that within the total continuing education hours for each license period to decrease the number of required hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours and add a new 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity training for all levels of licensure. Additionally, the board voted to add statutory language to change the license standard for the licensed psychology profession from a standard of having good moral character to meriting the public trust, which is a more uniform standard for the other professions and better matches the standard in other jurisdictions. The board also voted to add a new board member for behavior analyst profession. So if the bill passes, that would be a new position appointed to the board for that profession by the governor's office. The board voted to modify disciplinary remedies for behavior analyst profession so that they are more similar to the disciplinary remedies for the other professions. And then there are a number of statutory cleanup items to make sure that there is clear language for certain things like when a fee is charged to a licensee and the time frame and the process to reinstate a license and different things like that. So those were the statutory changes the board recommended. Additionally, we'll cover this a little bit later in the training today, but there's a difference in the board's authority between statutes, which are law, which have to go into a bill and then have to be passed by the legislature. Additionally, within the statutory framework of the law, the agency is able to offer changes to regulations, which allow the board to flush out the details under which they have statutory authority. So while the board is requesting those items I talked about to be put into a bill, which should be released any day, there's also some regulatory changes that are working their way through the system. One of those items the board had requested for regulatory changes involves the social work profession, addiction counseling, marriage and family therapy, and professional counseling. And those would allow those applicants to meet alternative requirements for licensure a little easier if they came from online programs by removing the requirement that some education be received while physically present and located at the school. And so that has to do with that in residence definition that was discussed in the face-to-face contact. And the board thinks that will help online schools or online only schools better meet alternative pathways for licensure requirements. Additionally, a regulation change the board is working on having submitted through the process is to allow continuing education for individuals who are coaching or mentoring individuals who are studying for the licensure examination. The board has heard that some individuals are having difficulty passing that examination. And so this was a way that the board could show support and provide continuing education hours for the licensees that are assisting those who are trying to pass that licensure exam and become professionals. Additionally, the board is supportive of regulatory change for the professional counseling applicants seeking to meet alternative requirements for licensure by allowing programs to be chaired or directed not only by someone with a doctorate for professional counseling, but to allow that person who is directing or chairing the program to have a doctorate in one of the other related fields. Additionally, the board is having regulatory changes go through right now for the master's level psychology applicants, that there be changes to remove a requirement of a certain number of classes taught by core faculty to allow greater flexibility for programs using experts and other adjunct faculty. And also the board recently voted at that last board meeting on the 18th to reduce cost for most temporary licenses. So most temporary licenses had a range of cost from $50 up to $150, and the board voted to make all of those standard temporary licenses no more than $50. And so that would be a change going through regulation. And then once that's set, all of the temporary licenses would be $50. Additionally, the board has scheduled a short meeting for February 8th, this Wednesday, and that is for the purpose of discussing recently introduced bills to allow the board to request any testimony prior to those bills being scheduled for a hearing. And then just a couple of legislative updates. The legislature is in full swing right now. Last week, the budget hearing for the BSRB budget was before the House Higher Education Budget Committee, and the recommendations on the budget before that committee are scheduled for 1:30 today at the Capitol. Additionally, the Senate budget hearing on the agency's budget will be scheduled or will take place on Wednesday morning, and it's expected that recommendations on the budget will be made that same day. And for those of you who follow the budget process, just a reminder, the BSRB does not request any money from the state general fund. As a fee-funded agency, we are required by statute to contribute up to 10% of revenues up to $100,000 per year to the state general fund. However, each year the legislature passes an appropriations bill and sets a limit on how much the agency is able to spend each fiscal year. And so that basically sets our cap. And within that cap, we can make expenditures, and we submit planned expenditures in certain areas. And we explain to the legislature why we want to make adjustments in certain areas, and they essentially set that cap for us. But we don't ask them for any money. We generally also do not receive any type of federal funding for the agency's budget. However, last week I did receive a notification. We had submitted 2 requests for funding for some of the available Spark funding, which was received by the state due to the pandemic. And they had opened up some of that Spark money for technology modernization and modernization to facilities. And so we submitted 2 requests for some of the federal funding. One was to replace a projector in the agency's boardroom, and the other was for a high quality camera to allow us to do hybrid meetings from the agency's boardroom. And both of those requests were supported and funded. And so we'll be learning more information this spring, but we're very happy to learn that information that we were approved for those 2 funding requests. Concerning the BSRB bill, as I mentioned, we hope that bill will be introduced in print sometime this week. When that is, we'll be able to share with you the House bill number and also the Senate bill number. We requested introduction of the bill in both the House and the Senate to allow both health agencies to work on it simultaneously. So that bill is expected to be introduced sometime this week. And then hopefully we'll be able to get a hearing on the bill in front of at least one of the 2 health committees, probably sometime next week. So with that, I will go ahead and end my report, and I can stand for any questions. I did notice that, yeah, I'll go ahead and end my report and stand for any questions.
Thank you, David. Any questions for him? You can tell we've been really busy, or he's been really busy. I'm not taking any credit for all that. Any questions?
This is Andrew. I have a comment and a couple questions.
Mhm.
Thank you, David, for your report and the amount of work that the BSRB board has been putting into things over the last couple of months. I know it started back probably in October. The first part, just a comment on the compact legislation, just for the advisory committee, is that the bill was introduced and currently shows it's been referred to the committee. So I know we're waiting to see if a hearing is going to get scheduled on that or not, but that did formally get entered. It's HB 2288 is the number for that House bill. So it is currently been introduced by Representative Susan Ruiz. And so we are waiting to just to see to hear if there's any formal work in that area. So just an update for folks there. And related to the reduction in time for service and from another jurisdiction. So I know that in the past, this has come up because Missouri had a lower threshold for, especially for independent licensure, that they don't require the NCMHCE to get licensed in Kansas. To get licensed in Missouri like we do in Kansas.
Right.
Is that changing that requirement, that there was a certain time frame they had to work in Missouri before Kansas would recognize that independent license for reciprocity? Is that what was changed, or was it something else?
So in the statutes for each of the profession, there is a normal reciprocity statute. And for that statute, it basically said for the non-clinical level of practitioners, you could either come from a jurisdiction that had substantially equivalent licensure requirements, or you could meet a separate set of requirements to come in through reciprocity. And one of those was to have practiced in that jurisdiction for 48 of the past 54 months. There's a different set of requirements if you're at a clinical level. But what the board recommended doing is for those normal time period for the reciprocity requirements, it would be decreasing that time period from 48 of 54 months down to 12 months. And I think one of the reasons they discussed when they were talking about that item is there was a bill that passed during the 2021 legislative session that changed a lot of the pathway for reciprocity for military members, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas, and also those that intend to reside in Kansas. And it created a fair amount of confusion, I think, by members of the public, because I believe some individuals thought when that bill passed that it covered everyone, and it doesn't. There's individuals who may reside, let's say in Kansas City, Missouri, and they're not a military member, military spouse. They don't reside in Kansas and they don't intend to reside in Kansas. And so they would not qualify even if they are just right across the border. So part of the effort, the board in this area was to make the reciprocity process a bit more uniform, and to try to take a lot of individuals in different groups and have as close as possible one standard for some of those reciprocity applicants. That military bill basically said if you have to go through your normal reciprocity evaluation, and if you don't qualify for that, but you do fit under that bill, then there's a different reciprocity process, which would say, did you operate under a similar scope of practice? And then did you practice in that jurisdiction for 1 year? So I think part of it was to try to make it align a little closer to what that military bill did for some of those applicants. Concerning the other topic that you discussed in terms of any changes to the testing, that really wasn't part of the discussion. And Leslie, do you have any other comments on that topic concerning their discussion on reciprocity, or anything that Andrew had asked about under that?
No, I think you covered it.
I guess there was also one small piece too, and that is that there's a number of multi-state compacts that are being discussed. And some of those multi-state compacts would really change the way that individuals can practice in Kansas without having to go through a lengthy period of time prior to practicing here. You know, SIPAC has a limited scope in that it mostly involves telehealth for licensed psychologists. But if you're a member state in SIPAC and then you get authority under the SIPAC commission, you can practice in Kansas essentially immediately. And for the professional counseling, if that passes in Kansas, and you get a privilege to practice, there's really no wait time that you have to go through in order to provide services in Kansas. And there's a social work compact that's currently being discussed. There's draft language for it, but it hasn't been finalized. But essentially, with all these multi-state compacts that are being discussed, the board's preference at the moment right now is to follow the licensing process. But seeing that other states are changing their reciprocity requirements and keeping in mind the different things like that military bill that passed and also the multi-state compacts, I think there was a discussion about, is this appropriate to lower that period of time?
I was going to say it makes sense in that regard. Thinking about on our end for our committee's purpose in our profession, that at the moment you look at who has legislation pending for the counseling compact specifically, and Nebraska and Colorado have already passed it. You've got Oklahoma and Missouri who have introduced legislation. Then you also have Arkansas, and you have Iowa, and I believe you have either Wyoming or Montana, and also maybe Minnesota. I don't know. Many of the Midwest states have all introduced legislation, so they may not all pass, but I counted it up the other day, if everybody that has already passed it and those that have introduced legislation were to pass, there'd be 36 of the 50 states that would be considered part of the counseling compact, somewhere around there, 34 to 36. And so the idea of some of these things and how they play out may not be serving the same role that they did before if we have all this agreed upon language for privileges and so forth. But I was just curious to know how that was being looked at, just with these compacts, some of the higher standards. And we've made some reductions, such as like the overall hours to clinical license, our supervision hours, and now with this reduction down to how long in another jurisdiction. I was just curious to know that. So thank you for your answer there. The last one I had was just pertaining to the change in the diagnosis and treatment.
Hey, excuse me, Andrew, before you switch, can you bring me up to speed when it comes to the counseling compact? Is that like a super license for all these 36 states, or what is that?
No, it's not. David, do you care if I answer, or do you want to answer?
Go ahead.
Okay. The counseling compact is not a super license in a sense, but what it does is it creates a common understanding and acceptance across the member states to be part of a commission that would then be able to grant privileges to different counselors within those states to practice in other member states. So it doesn't grant a license for each state, because in order to do that, you would still have to go through the licensure process for each home state. So every state maintains its own licensure system. Nothing changes in that regard. All of that remains the same. It does create a mechanism where a person that changes member states, so if they move and relocate to a different member state, there's a process to obtain licensure in that home state through being already part of the compact. Whereas people coming from non-member states would not have that opportunity for that different licensure process there to obtain a license. But you can only have one licensed home state in a sense under the commission. So it's a privilege to practice in different states, not a license to practice in those states. But it recognizes it similarly as we would a license without granting a formal license from each state. So it's a way for us to allow for states to maintain their sovereignty and sense of what their current laws and what the rules are surrounding licensure, but also creating a mechanism to allow more opportunity for providers to follow clients and for clients to keep their providers and so forth, so long as they're in member states.
So are you aware of some of the things that the ACA is going to doing in terms of having a super license? I mean, is that kind of in concert or?
This is what ACA did. They went away from the portability piece because they couldn't get enough states to open up their licensure laws. Would be a huge thing, understandable. And so they went the compact route, which seems to be more acceptable. And it also gives states legislatures the ability, if the commission passes certain rules, that if a number of states legislatures don't agree with the rule, that it would nullify that rule. So it creates space within certain parameters to give states some control over some of this, while also creating a more expansive way for professional counselors to work in the country without having to get licensed state by state. But they do have to get a privilege state by state and still pay for that. But we're agreeing to accept each other's licenses if you're part of those member states.
Thank you.
David, can we send out to the committee the presentation that Andrew wrote and presented to the board in October?
Sure.
I think that'd be very helpful. It was thorough and really gave a great framing.
Okay.
Thank you.
I did want to add one item about the compact as well. So the compact covers the clinical level of licensure for professional counseling. So in Kansas right now, combined for professional counseling profession, we have about 2,100 individuals that are licensed as professional counselors or clinical professional counselors. On the clinical level, though, we have about 1,088 at the clinical level and about 1,012 at the non-clinical level. So this would be available for those individuals that qualified otherwise under the clinical level, but there still would be about 1,000 individuals that would be under our normal licensure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because that is the decided upon language was a unrestricted independent license. Was what the commission, the Council of State Governments and folks came up with when they came up with everything. So it does only apply to, in any state, a person independently licensed and without any encumbrances within the last 2 years, meaning no disciplinary actions and so forth. So.
Any other questions?
I just had a question about the diagnosis and treatment change. And in my last one, but with that, I was wondering, some states, so I'm certainly not opposed to the idea of adding in cultural diversity as part of our training. I do wonder about reducing the number of diagnostic hours, just because being a person that's in the diagnostic realm, I sometimes think people need all the help we can get in the diagnostic place and keeping that up to date. But I was curious if there's been any conversation about the addition of training within risk assessment and suicide, like some states have, given the ongoing problem within that realm and what sometimes seems to be a lack of preparation to navigate or understand suicide well. I'm wondering if the BSRB at some point plans to have discussion about any kinds of requirements surrounding the topic of suicide. I don't remember what states. I know there's some states that already have a requirement or introduced one that require like an hour or two or something of training.
I think Missouri does.
Yes, I thought Missouri may have been one. Thank you. Atcha for that. But I was just curious, David, if anybody has talked about that as well.
Yeah, so a little bit of the history on that item. That was initially brought forward in draft legislation last year that had a recommendation by the board to require 3 hours in diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And that was offered on behalf of the licensed psychology profession that had been supported by the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee. And prior to that, representatives from the Kansas Psychological Association, KPA, had made that request to the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee. But when that was discussed in legislative committees, when they did a hearing on the bill, they had some concerns, and some of their concerns included really what would be the definition of DEI, what items would qualify under that. They also were concerned about the flexibility of individuals to be able to take continuing education in areas which they thought were relevant to their fields. Right now, for all licensees, there's 3 hours of ethics that are required for individuals that can diagnose and treat. There's 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment. So when the board discussed this item, they discussed continuing education requirements broadly. And I did some research on continuing education requirements for other states. I found that our ethics requirement is pretty widely accepted in other states. Our 6-hour requirement in diagnosis and treatment is a bit unique. There's not a lot of other states that have a requirement specifically in that area. And so when these items were discussed by the legislative committee last year, as I mentioned, one item they asked about was, clarity on the definition, and then also a 3-hour requirement on top of what was already required, they thought might be too restrictive in terms of people being able to make choices about what they wanted to take for continuing education. So I think the proposal by the board, the one that they recommended, was trying to serve different purposes. One was to make sure that licensees would still have some flexibility and freedom to take hours in different fields. So this way it would maintain that the standard of 9 hours being required in certain categories would still remain 9 hours for individuals that could diagnose and treat. For individuals that can't, it would be a new 3-hour requirement, but the remainder of their hours would be available. And then in terms of the change from diversity, equity, and inclusion to cultural diversity, there was discussion that the licensed psychology or the board that licenses psychologists in Texas has a current requirement of 6 hours in cultural diversity training. And the way that they defined that was professional development regarding age, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, language, national origin, race, religion, culture, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. So that specific definition would be included in the bill as well to give some additional clarity on that. In terms of suicide prevention or other topics, I did provide a memo to the board. I had done a little research at what other states may require, and there were some other different categories that are required in different states. And the board discussed a couple of different proposals, but they decided to add the requirement or support legislation to add a requirement for the hours in cultural diversity training right now. There were a lot of other items that were discussed, but the one the board recommended was this one, but they did discuss other options as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions for David? Okay, thank you, David, and everyone else. Okay, let's move on to old business. Our first discussion will be around continued conversation around unprofessional conduct regulations. We did not finish that last time. So David Fye, are you going to share your screen and we'll move right through those changes?
Yes, and so at the past meeting, I had provided a document. Well, we had minutes from the subcommittee that met to review unprofessional conduct regulation changes, and in your minutes during the last advisory committee meeting, we were able to get through a number of those possible changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations for the professional counseling profession. We needed to pick up at a certain point through that. So what I have done is I've created a table in Excel, and in the left column, it has the existing language in the unprofessional conduct regulation. On the right side, it has potential recommended changes by the subcommittee or other comments in terms of if there was discussion, but not necessarily a specific recommended change. So I will share my screen. And you should be able to see now an Excel document. As I mentioned, the left column includes the current language for this item in the unprofessional conduct regulations. In the right column, it includes any kind of reference the subcommittee made to any potential changes. And sometimes there were specific recommendations, sometimes there was discussion, but maybe not a specific recommendation. So if the advisory committee could continue to work through these today, the hope is for these changes to be finalized today, and that way they could be forwarded to the board for review. The authority of the advisory committee is to make recommendations to the board. It's the board that would be the body that would ultimately be deciding on recommended changes. So based on my notes, I had us down as getting through item 26. So we would be picking up with item 33. And in your packet of materials, I also included the unprofessional conduct regulations for the profession, which is KAR 102-3-12A. And you also had a second document that is a copy of 102-3-12A. The more lengthy version, there was a past professional conduct advisory committee or professional counseling advisory committee who looked at possible changes. And so the second document has some of their potential change language. And so the subcommittee had reviewed both documents and made comments. And so when that second document comes into play, I'll go ahead and reference that. But the first item, item 33, the current language is claiming or using any secret or special method of treatment or techniques that one refuses to disclose to the board. And then the discussion by the subcommittee was they questioned the use of the phrase secret or special treatment and considered alternative language such as untested or experimental. And I think based on the way we have this set up, it's going to be difficult for me to see if any of you have your hand raised. So if you do have questions or comments, feel free to just say them. And then I think maybe the best way to go ahead to handle these would be that if there's no objection, it would be interpreted as the consensus of the advisory committee to accept this recommended change. But if you feel differently, if you have any objections, please feel free to ask any questions or make any statements. So on item 33, is there any objection to making that change from secret or special treatment to untested or experimental? Okay, I don't hear any opposition. So for 33, we will say that that was approved by consensus. For item 34, the current language is continuing or ordering test procedures or treatments or using treatment facilities or services not warranted by the condition, best interest, or preferences of the client. For that item, the subcommittee members express support for replacing the term tests with the word assessments. Is there any questions or any objections to that modification?
No.
Okay. We'll see no objections. We'll take that as the consensus. Go ahead and then make that change. For item 35, this item involves failing to maintain a record for each client that conforms to certain minimal requirements. Under specifically D, one of the requirements would be that it summarizes the interventions, treatments, tests, procedures, and services that were obtained, performed, ordered, or recommended, and the findings and result of each. And the subcommittee members express support for replacing the term test with assessments. Any objections to that modification?
No objection.
I have a question. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Mhm.
So I've seen the word ordered in there a couple of times. I'm wondering if that is, I mean, I'm okay with the term, but ordered tends to be more of like a medical term, like doctors ordering or nurses ordering, like labs or something of that nature. I'm fine if it stays there because it may be that there are things that we could order maybe, but I just don't know if that word is necessary there. I mean, we tend to make recommendations or referrals to folks, but it may not be a big enough deal to take that out. as it's maybe being there to cover. I just didn't know if we knew if any other thoughts about the term ordered or not.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I had a question about that, but I'm not sure how much, how important that is to change, but
Right. Yeah.
that's
may-
more like what a psychologist would do, or
More of a medical doctor. I was
It
thinking
is.
requests rather than ordered, requested.
Referred.
Recommend.
Yeah, recommended is there.
Or referred. I think of referred to, like we tend to refer people or,
Uh-huh.
obtained, performed, requested, referred, or recommended. But again, like Bob said, I don't know if it's a big enough deal for us to change it. It's in there a few times, twice, I think now, at least what we've seen so
Mhm.
far. So I just thought I'd ask.
Now's our chance.
Now, before we do that, my question is does that word order, does that reflect maybe a legal thing? Where a court has ordered something and therefore we're fulfilling that assessment. And I don't know for sure if this is the same or different, but I know a lot of times we do get court orders for things.
Yeah, Michael, I think that's reasonable thinking about it in the legal sense. When I look at where it's listed, it's talking about summarizes the interventions, treatments, tests, procedures, and services that were obtained. If you're saying ordered, I mean, I guess you could say did a legal entity order something to happen, in which case it's not what the professional is
Right.
ordering, but what the professional's done in response to an order. I guess would be in that kind of case situation. So I mean, it could be a legal sense too, which mean be fine to leave it in that case, just so it covers everything.
As I read on now, Andrew, I'm sorry, I do see the F does say, oh, I guess it's legible, not legal.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is definitely a good point, that this is really reflective of what the counselor is recommending.
Mhm.
So I would not be against changing that wordage.
I feel like there
I
was
would
support
support that
for,
as well.
go ahead, Laura.
I would support that as well, to change it.
I would too, to
Yes.
requested or referred.
And Harriet, what was the first word you said?
Requested.
Okay. It looks like, okay, so maybe just change ordered to requested or referred.
I like requested.
I think there are things that we order in a sense, right? I mean, we assign tasks, like people could say that's ordered in some way. But yeah, just in the sense of the word, it just seems like it's implying something maybe that's outside of what we do. But yeah,
Okay.
Fine with it.
and that would also be in number 34.
To change ordering to
Yeah, requested.
what's it? Continuing or requesting test procedures or treatments.
Mhm. It would keep it consistent.
Yeah, I would think so.
Or
Continuing, that word there implies that we're already doing, because I'm thinking about the administration, like we can administer, it's like the administration or. So I just want to make sure whatever we write doesn't somehow imply that we're not doing something that we are doing too. So is that continuing there, continuing or ordering suggests that we're already in the process of being able to administer?
I think the continuing part would be ordering could be starting fresh, I believe, but
So I just want to make sure that what we write doesn't somehow, and I'm just thinking about this maybe too narrowly. I just want to make sure it doesn't remove our some of the language we have that allows us to do assessment, or that we're doing somehow administration of assessments within our scope of practice already. So that's I think already defined. Is that defined by the act itself, the statute?
In terms of the scope of practice?
Right, in terms of like the assessment and diagnosis, treatment, all that kind of stuff. Because if it is, then changing this wouldn't affect what we can do.
And Leslie, do you have any comment on that?
No,
Okay.
Just out of curiosity, where it says continuing or ordering tests, is there a reason why that couldn't be replaced with the word providing? Providing test procedures or treatment?
Because the key part of it really is services not warranted by the condition, interests, or preferences of the client. I mean, that's really the crux of what 34 is about.
Yeah.
Right.
Providing something that's not necessary, not warranted.
Yeah, for some reason, when Andrew pointed out that continuing, it does seem like it's a little out of place there.
Yeah, I think providing could be providing or, and then continuing on, because I think that is the issue there. Like what you guys were talking about is the idea that this is something that we're doing. We're rendering a service that's not indicated by the person's condition. I am thinking about this term order too, like because we have folks in the hospital, and I'm trying to think about whether or not those folks are able to order things within a hospital setting. I have some emergency department clinicians that I supervise that do the assessments, and
Under an ex parte or something like that too.
yeah,
I didn't think about that. I'm assuming that under an ex parte custody order, they would be able to order certain evaluations to occur.
yeah, or like I know they make recommendations to like they work in consultation with emergency department doctors and the psychiatrists in the hospitals, but I don't know if they can. I'm wondering if within their reports they could order in the sense of the hospital setting certain things that we wouldn't think that we're able to do in a private practice setting. I don't know enough about it, that particular term. So I'm sorry, I'm just thinking, trying to think through that now that I've asked, but I should have caught this during the subcommittee meeting, David. Sorry about that.
That's okay. And if you know, if we do want to be really careful about accidentally changing something that would have a domino effect in the future, we could always leave the term ordered in there and then just add terms to it.
Yeah.
We could just leave ordered or ordering in there and then just add requested or requesting as well. That way, I don't think it would hurt anything. These regulations have been in place since about 2008. So, but additional clarity is helpful as well.
So continuing, comma, ordering, comma, or requesting tests. Is that what you're saying?
That's something that we could do pretty easily. Is there support for that?
I'd be fine adding to it, just given the fact that we're not sure what we could be affecting if that's there. I think providing maybe instead of continuing would be a better term there on 34, like Michael was indicating.
So again, changing, continuing to what?
Maybe providing or ordering, / requesting assessments, procedures, or treatments.
Mhm. It's more comprehensive that way. Yeah.
Was there any opposition to go ahead and adding continuing and they're changing continuing to providing and adding requesting in 34. And then for 35, add requested following ordered.
I support that.
Sounds good.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds like there's consensus. So we will move to item 37. So 37 currently says if engaged in research failing to fulfill these requirements, and then it lists 4 different requirements. The document by the past Professional Counseling Advisory Committee had possible changes to this item, which would rephrase that as failing to consider the possible consequences on participants, failing to take all reasonable precautions on behalf of participants' welfare, or causing emotional, physical, or social harm to participants through the research process, according to all current state and federal laws and statutes for conducting research. And so the subcommittee members indicated support for continuing to include language that the consent of each participant be voluntary and informed. And the item was highlighted for additional discussion by the full advisory committee. So I wanted to bring item 37 to you to see if you would be in favor of making a change to item 37 by either replacing that current language of 37 with the new language, or if you had any other thoughts on this item. So I guess I'll say, is the possible change, there was some support for some of that language, and also that the consent of each participant be voluntary and informed. Is there consensus to go ahead and move forward with that type of language to replace the current language in 37 with the new language, and to add in that the support for continuing to have it each participant be the consent of each participant be voluntary and informed?
I think that's more congruent with the client-centered approach that the counseling is moving toward. So I would support that.
I too.
Do we think that this one specifically addresses the issue of, it says federal laws and statutes for conducting research, which, as I look at that, of course, would roll in the privacy protections, anonymity, and so forth. Do we think we need to be more specific about that part, or do we think that people will understand that within conducting research that covers, if we say follow all state and federal laws for conducting research, that'll include the privacy, anonymity, confidentiality, and so forth? I mean, I know that it would have been that, but I've been trained to do research, so it's like I get that. But do we think the average person is going to, I don't mean average person, but like average professional who's coming into this new, looking at our regulations, will they take this as, I need to make sure I keep stuff private and so forth? And they should, but.
You're saying just specifically mention it. It needs to be named.
I don't know if it needs to be. I'm just asking for people's thoughts to see if we think that saying state and federal laws and statutes would address that part of D of preserving privacy and protect the anonymity of each subject in terms of informed consent.
Do we address that anywhere else within the document? That confidentiality and protecting?
I think we do for the therapy piece, but this is specific to research.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see another one specific to research.
If it's not mentioned anywhere else in the document, it might be reasonable to add something in there.
I don't know if just towards the end where it says like, according to all state and federal laws and statutes for conducting research.
Ensuring confidentiality
Yeah,
and informed consent. So adding that at the end.
yeah.
Is there support for that from the advisory committee?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Would it say while ensuring confidentiality, informed consent? Because I want to make sure that it doesn't get lumped together with if someone were to read it and to think that it was just following state and laws and statutes, conducting research like with regard to confidentiality, but that they're expected to follow all rules and laws around research. And we're also specifically saying like, as well as this, like, don't forget, like, this is part of it.
Right.
I don't know if that means.
Mhm. Add the word while ensuring confidentiality and informed consent.
Something like that. I mean, it doesn't have to be that word. Somebody might have a better one, but and I could be getting way too specific. So if I am, people can stop me too. So my mind can tend to get really like focused on stuff.
I like the adding of that, Andrew. I think it can't hurt to be explicit. It's an important thing that
Mhm.
we don't need to assume is implied.
is there some additional language I should add to the end of that?
Do you think we should say privacy, since privacy is the legal term, confidentiality is an ethical term? So do you want to use the word privacy instead? Just because I think that's the legal.
I think that's a good change. Yeah.
I do too. It's a great designation.
Okay, is there consensus about this? Sounds like there is. So, okay, great. Thank you. That's for 37. The next item is item 43. All right, so that says that the professional counselor or clinical professional counselor is the owner or custodian of client records, failing to retain these records for at least 5 years after the date of termination of the professional relationship unless otherwise provided by law. And for that item, the subcommittee members express support for adding additional language to clarify whether a different length of time is necessary for retention of minor records. And I am
Isn't it
unsure.
10 years for after the minor turns 18? Wouldn't it?
I believe that's correct.
There is a state law with respect to medical record retention, and we probably should specify that in here, so it's not something different. And it is, I believe it is 10 years after the age, after
18.
a certain, yeah. And I forget what the other one is. I've been retired too long.
I guess the question on this one is, it does say to retain them for 5 years unless otherwise provided by law. Would it be helpful for us to add additional clarifying language concerning how long minor records are to be kept? And then
I think that would be really important.
I agree, because I can't see
that.
everybody running and looking that up. I think it's great for it to be specified here.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say that the 10 years you all referring to, at least what I see, is for hospitals that are required to maintain records for up to 10 years after. But it looks like that was, trying to see here what that was listed. There was the Kansas Hospital Association record retention. And so there, under Kansas law, each hospital shall maintain medical records for each patient admitted for care. Each medical record shall be kept on file for 10 years after the date of last discharge of the patient, or 1 year beyond the date that patients who are minors reach their majority, whichever is longer.
Yeah.
So But that, I don't know that that language necessarily applies to our profession. So I just want to make sure we're looking at I understand what we're looking at. If there's something.
Yeah. Again, I just think we need to look what the state law says as far as medical record retention. That you're correct. That is the hospital, the Kansas Hospital Association, but I can't remember where we dug that up from, to tell you the truth.
From
Okay.
an organizational perspective, what occurs is if we can't find out easily what that time period is, we typically go with the strictest we can find, and that's the 10 years.
Mhm.
It's not, and I've looked this up before, it's not easy to find those time periods
Mhm.
for our, for counselors. So
So I do see for Kansas and a different thing. It does say, see 10 years from when professional service was provided. Kansas admin reg 100-24-2A, it's actually from 2008. And then for adult patients, full records 10 years after the last discharge of the patient. And then for minor patients, the full record is 10 years or 1 year beyond the date that the patient reaches the age of majority. So until they turn 19, whichever is longer. Summary of destroyed records for both adults and minors is 25 years. And that's in KAR 28-34-9A D1. Looks like where that's listed.
Andrew, could you give me that citation again?
Yeah, so the first one is KAR 100-24-2A, and that's cited for 2008. And then the other one was KAR 28-34-9A, and then parentheses D, and parentheses 1. And that's also 2008 is what looks like it's citing.
Okay. Okay, I'll try to do a little research on those and see if I can make sure that there's nothing that's more up to date on those.
So do any of the other professions have anything like this in theirs and may have already identified that for a profession that's related to us specifically?
I don't recall a conversation like this.
Okay.
I know that there has been a little bit of discussion. A lot of the other professions, they have a separate unprofessional conduct statute on record keeping. And so some of it does talk about making sure that you retain records for an appropriate length of time, but I don't recall us really getting into what length of time would be within the other statutes or regulations. So. Okay, well, I will do a little research and make sure that we have some reference there based on whatever is required in law for the different categories. For item number 44, supervising or directing in a negligent manner anyone for whom one has supervisory or directory responsibility. And then for this item, the subcommittee members asked for clarification whether the language would cover supervision of students, and expressed a desire for clarification to make sure that safety of students is covered. And so, Leslie, I know that you and I had talked a little bit about the definition of supervisor and supervising for the different professions, because at one point there was a little bit of confusion about whether the term supervision would relate to employment supervision or whether it would relate to supervision within the context of, supervising someone for the profession. And so in terms of if this would cover students, so I honestly do not know. I don't know that we have a real legal opinion on this topic. So I don't know that I have more to really add to it, but we could definitely add some language to cover it if we wanted to specifically call out the relationship between someone who has students.
I remember us talking about this because I know of at least an instance where in another profession's regulations, there was some, the only there was some, what I think we would consider to be misconduct on the part of a supervisor, but because the regulations didn't cover conduct within the supervisory relationship, only covered if I think it was maybe been this, that there was like unacceptable supervision was provided. It was more about the supervision versus the conduct of the person doing the supervision. And because it was with a student, there was less ability for the person to be held responsible for what was going on. And so I think that given the power dynamic between a supervising professional and a student intern who's rendering services under that person, and knowing that there may be loopholes that really intelligent people might be able to find around our stuff. I just want to make sure that when we're putting people that are at a power imbalance within our profession, that we are ensuring that our regulations cover conduct by professionals rendering that whatever is, even that means we have to create a different thing. Being a person in counselor ed, and Bob is as well, I take very seriously our students being protected, and that there should be some sort of liability on the part of a person that does something negligent or engages in unprofessional behavior with a student while they're under their internship supervision, whatever you want to call it. But that's where this kind of came from.
I've been out of that role of student internship supervisor, but it seems like KCREP guidelines address this in some way, I think, and how supervision is to take place, and what's appropriate and not.
Sure. I'm just saying, if it's not clearly stated within our misconduct regulations, it may be that KCREP or ACA or someone could take issue if there is an ethics issue, if the person's a member, but without it being listed at the state level, that really inhibits the BSRB from being able to investigate or potentially even take any action against a licensed professional who's engaging in unprofessional behavior with a student.
So maybe we ought to look at those guidelines from ACA and from KCREP, so that we're not making changes that are different from that to be consistent.
Although that's also important to do, I think it's important to add the word student right here so that there's no question.
What if we put in here supervising or directing any supervisee or student in a neglectful manner?
Yeah.
Negligent. Because as Andrew was talking, one of the things that I was thinking about is the relationship. We have several students at our organization, and it's not just their direct supervisor supervising them. There's a lot of professionals in the agency that are providing supervision to them.
And so Michael, what was the second?
More unofficially, but yes, you're right.
What was the second word? Supervising, or what was the second word?
Just sticking with what it has there, supervising or directing any supervisee or student in a, but you guys may want to change that however you like, but that was just a suggestion.
Well, it's more comprehensive that way, certainly.
I think the issue David was getting at was that legally supervision and direction are two different things. Like supervision is when a person's under a general training plan. Is how they look at that, is like if you're under a clinical training plan, then that's when supervision is being provided. If you are not on a training plan, but you're practicing, that person, while they're your supervisor, they're providing direction and not providing necessarily supervision in the legal sense. And so the question becomes, does supervising or directing apply to a student who's not a licensed professional? Or do we need to add, is it a person that's supervising, directing, or training? I mean, I don't know if we put down training or something in that respect to cover student work, but at the same time, I don't know how that gets into the legalities of things there too. But David, I think that might have been what you were trying to get at earlier too, is does a student fall within the categories that are established or not?
Mhm. Yeah, and I don't believe I referenced this during the subcommittee meeting, but we've had this come up for some of the other advisory committees as well. The use of the term negligent. Negligence is really more of a legal term. That's a much more loaded term than may have been intended. Some of the other advisory committees have talked about replacing the word negligent with harmful. Negligent, just, negligence itself implies sort of a whole scope of or whole lot of different items that I think, if it seems suitable for you, we could also have a replacement of the word negligent with harmful.
Yeah.
How about we just add harmful to negligent? Because, again, both words could be interpreted one way or another. So you say supervising or directing, I'm thinking just adding rather than subtracting.
So harmful or negligent?
Yeah, one or the other.
From a legal sense, David, what is having both in there do for the sense of, I guess, public protection? Again, thinking about the idea, this is about protecting the public, but what does this do to the enforcement? Like if we have harmful or negligent, does that then is there any benefit to having one versus both, just from your perspective?
So not legal advice.
Sure.
But what it appears to me is that there is a negligent that really means you have a duty and there's a breach of a duty and there's harm and there's a causation and all the legal principles that are involved in negligence as a legal term. But I think there's also a common understanding of the term negligent too, which is sort of reckless, or there's harmful consequences of the way that you did something. So I think as long as you included an or where you had it one or the other, I think it would be fine, because then if someone was trying to meet the previous standard, that would be fine. Or if they were going towards more of a common language intention using harmful, I think that would be fine too. So I think you could replace it, or I think you could also just leave that and then add or harmful, and it would probably be okay.
Okay. I was going to say one may have a bigger burden of proof to demonstrate than the other.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's very valid. It just kind of depends on what you think the standard should be in this situation. For most of these, the review is going to be done by the committee that reviews disciplinary matters by the board. And so they're going to be going through the information provided by the investigators and trying to do an evaluation. And so it just kind of depends on if you think that term should be replaced, or if you think there should be a little bit of flexibility to evaluate it under different terminology. So in terms of the conversation about supervisees and students, I put down adding a specific reference to supervisee or students. Is there any additional language that you would like me to add for that item? Okay, so is there consensus for both of those changes? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, well then we will go ahead and forward those to the board for consideration. Item 47. Item 47 says failing to inform the proper authorities as provided in KSA 38-2320 or 2223 and amendments thereto, that one knows or has reason to believe that a client has been involved in harming or has harmed a child, whether by physical, mental, or emotional abuse or neglect, or by sexual abuse. And so for this item, the subcommittee members express support for removing the term sexual abuse to the section of the regulation that includes physical, mental, and emotional abuse rather than following neglect. And then just to let you know, I did do a little bit of research after those meetings. Item 47 links to that statute, which is reporting of certain abuse or neglect of children, persons reporting, reports made by whom, penalties, immunity from liability. And then under that statute, it does specifically say the specific language in the statute currently states physical, mental, or emotional abuse or neglect or sexual abuse. So I think there was an effort by the subcommittee to kind of clean up the language, but I guess having done a little bit of research on that, it looks like the specific language in our regulation matches the current statutory language in the other one. So at this point, I would recommend probably keeping the language the way that it is, just to have more of a parallel. Even if it's not the best way to phrase that, we probably should keep the language that the statute has.
I would support that.
Okay, and then the next item is item 51. Offering to perform or performing any service, procedure, or therapy that by the accepted standards of professional counseling or clinical professional counseling practice in the community would constitute experimentation on human subjects without first obtaining the full, informed, and voluntary written consent of the client or the client's legal representative or representatives. And for this item, the subcommittee members discussed whether some of the content of this item might already be covered in item 33 and item 37 and highlighted the item for further discussion. I think we discussed 37.
Yeah, didn't we add in on 37 that consent?
We added in, you recommended adding in privacy. Yeah. For item 37, recommendation was to add while ensuring privacy and informed consent. And then for item 33, that was claiming or using any secret or special method of treatment or techniques that one refuses to disclose to the board. So I guess the question before you now is item 51, do you believe that there's too much overlap and so this needs to be modified? Or would you like to go ahead and leave this one as it stands? Either way would be fine.
You know, as I look at this, David, a second time around, 33 deals with whether or not we've notified the board that we're using something, not notified the client. 37 has to do with research specifically and informed consent about research. So if this is talking about practice, this is talking about our giving the client full informed consent and getting consent, for this, which makes it really its own standalone part again versus being covered by the other two, since the other two, I believe, are covering different topics. Just thoughts that I'm having now that I'm looking at this again from our first conversation.
Yeah, so on this, I know earlier we talked about assessments. Do we need any language in there referring to that as well?
Oh, like any service, procedure, assessment, or therapy, like adding assessment in there?
Yeah, I just
leaving it. Yeah.
wondering if that would be needed. But I think you're right. This seems to be more directed toward treatment rather than research.
Yeah. And it's geared toward notifying the client versus notifying the board. So if we took this out, then we would be removing the requirement to notify the client of the process rather than, and we'd be notifying the board like, oh, hey, here, you guys know we're doing it, but we don't tell the, if we don't tell the client, then. So I think we should leave that and add assessment.
Okay. Is there consensus on that, Adam?
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on to the next item. Item 55, diagnosing or treating any client who a professional counselor practicing under direction or a clinical professional counselor has reason to believe is suffering from a mental illness or disease as opposed to a mental disorder. And then for item 55, subcommittee members discussed the language of the regulation and the difficulty in differentiating between mental disorder, mental illness, and or disease. Advisory committee members expressed support for removing this regulation. So is there support for removing item number 55?
Yes, from me.
I'm not sure I understand what 55 is actually saying.
Michael, when Bob and I were meeting as part of the subcommittee, what we thought this might be was a reference back to a time when looking at the difference between like a mental illness such as psychiatry would treat psychiatrists versus mental disorders, which is what therapists would treat. And while there might have been a distinction at one time, that really we treat people with mental illnesses. I mean, people that are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, any type of thing that a psychiatrist would have a medication or manage or so forth, that we're going to be treating those folks too in conjunction with that person. And so this language is somehow indicating the difference between mental illness or disease and a mental disorder. Unless mental illness is only talking about like neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental issues, which is a whole different thing. It seems to be saying something that maybe we don't need it to say anymore.
Right. It really has to do with scope of practice, understanding, being aware of, and practicing within your scope of practice. Isn't that the current language, the way that we need to look at it?
Mhm.
Okay.
But it sounds like there's consensus on this one to remove this regulation.
Looked like Bob was going to say something, but then he stepped away for a second.
Okay, well,
Let's keep moving. If he comes back and needs to add to it, we can go back.
that sounds great.
Oh,
Okay.
there he is. Bob,
Sorry.
did you want to say something about item 55?
No, I don't think it needs to be in there.
Okay, thank you. That was the consensus.
Great. Okay, then I'll forward that to the board. And then, so there is some language in that second document that I referenced, some additional items that the task group of professional counseling advisory committee members had recommended. There are 3 new possible regulations. So I'll go ahead and read through these. The first one would say it would be unprofessional conduct, practicing inappropriate boundaries with clients with regard to use of social media, including but not limited to using a personal profile to connect or communicate with clients on any social media platform, or accessing a client's social media page without previous consent. The second one would be disclosing confidential information through public social media. And the third would be if engaged in distance counseling, failing to fulfill these requirements. A, informing the client of risks and benefits of distance counseling. B, disclosing the possibility of technology failure and providing alternative methods of service. C, detailing emergency procedures to follow when the counselor is unavailable. And D, taking appropriate steps to encrypt or secure the security of confidential client information or any activity that protects confidential client information from risk of privacy breach. So 2 of these are specifically towards social media, and a third is really towards telehealth practice. And the subcommittee members expressed support for adding the proposed language for each of these regulations. So do you have any comments, or is there consensus to go ahead and add these, or would you like to modify any of this language?
Sounds like consensus to me.
So yeah, it sounds like consensus to add all 3 of them, unless there's any other comments. Okay, then we will move to the last item. Additionally, subcommittee members supported adding additional regulations based on language in the American Counseling Association ACA Code of Ethics as it relates to telehealth practice. Subcommittee members discussed disclosure of practitioner telehealth credentials and training, disclosure of physical location of practice and provider contact information, mindfulness of time zone differences, expected delivery response times, and consistency of telehealth services being provided in the state. So is there support for adding a new regulation concerning that topic?
Definitely.
Yeah, I'd support this also, and I don't know what the board's talked about in the past, but when it comes to continuing education, this might be something to consider in the future as well.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, you know, we're doing a lot of remote services, more than, you know, we ever did before the pandemic. And so we're requiring our providers to go through training on how to maintain confidentiality, to do full disclosures, things like that with their clients. And it's just a different approach. And I think a lot of providers that maybe aren't used to doing that may not know exactly the steps to take to ensure confidentiality when providing that treatment.
Mhm.
So just something to consider as times change.
And Michael, I would agree with you. And it's been a long-standing concern of mine is the lack of, you're talking about continuing education, which I'm like, okay, let's talk about that for sure. And I'm thinking even education in general, how I'm doing this work. And I know there's been some discussion within the board, I guess, about updating what our telehealth requirements are, because we didn't really ever define that. Beyond the state's Practice Act for telehealth, didn't really get defined what the responsibilities were of a person using this, and that at that time far less remote work was being done. And now that we had everybody move remote, and with large percentages of people, according to the literature, remaining in remote work, both clients want to stay that way and providers are staying that way. You know, there's really no way of knowing who's educated themselves to do this properly, who has the right documentation in place, and who is just saying, I'm just doing the same thing I did in my office, just online, without considering any other factors, which is not an ethical or even a best practice way of conducting telehealth work. So I think this is an attempt on our part to try to get some language in there to support the idea that there's responsibilities for providers when it comes to telehealth work. And, you know, I think it's going to be an area, as you suggested, Michael, that we're going to be talking about for many years as we unpack all the rapid movement with the pandemic into remote work.
Right.
Again, it's been a while since I was teaching, since I'm retired, but when I was teaching in a counseling prep program, I included a unit in the techniques of counseling on online counseling. And I remember that there was a code of ethics that was developed for online counseling that I included. I'm not sure now, but somehow I remember finding that code of ethics.
Through the
Are you
ACA?
guys
Through the ACA Code of Ethics? Is that what you're talking
No, I don't think so. No, it wasn't.
Yeah, ACA has some, NBCC has some. There's also like the Telemental Health Institute, which there's an actual association that has guidelines for this as well. So there are a number of folks that have established kind of best practices and ethics regarding telehealth practice. So if we were ever going to do more, this is just kind of our entry point. If we ever want to do more across the board, I think that's a lot of times, I know the state, especially if we're going to add stuff, they like to see us make those changes across professions, and it would seem that those types of things would be important for everybody. So yeah, there's several entities that have that, but yeah, there is a association that develops something specific to that area, which I think is what you're referring to.
Yes. And, you know, for us to take a look at that, you know, in the future, in terms of anything that we might add here.
David and Leslie, as far as you know, are there movements in the other disciplines at the BSRB to address telehealth?
There's no subcommittees that have been requested for that. A lot of the advisory committees are trying to incorporate more policies, or at least the language for current policies in the unprofessional conduct regulation, by keeping telehealth in mind. But in terms of a big project for any of the professions, none of them have started to work on that. We've just asked them to kind of keep that in mind when reviewing the professional conduct regulations. And I think that's kind of the first step right now. But aside from that, I'm not aware of anything else.
Andrew, do you have access to all of those documents from the ACAC, the NBCC that deal with telehealth?
I have. We used ACAs and NBCCs in a training that I put together for our students with some best practices pieces. And then I am looking for, see if I can find, there's guidelines for practice of some of the stuff is psychology. So I've spent some time looking for the other one, but there are practice guidelines for telepsychology. So I want to say that but I do have access to at least 2 of the 3. So I can provide stuff.
Would you please send those to David and to me, and then David and I can craft a way to make sure that we're paying attention to this and to see how far we want to take it. This sounds like good work for us to do.
Yeah. If either you or David could send me an email that I can flag, so that way I can make sure I don't forget, because there are a number of things on my list and I don't want to forget to send you stuff.
I'll do that. I'll do that after our meeting.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I make it a short comment here?
Please.
Let's just, I know we talked about this in our last meeting. Let's be careful that we don't take just everything that comes from the NBCC and ACA, because the state law is always above any of those organizations. So let's be careful about that. We set a tone, and let's take from what they have, but let's craft what we think is going to be good, without, again, even if it doesn't completely align with what ACA and NBCC put out. So just so we are careful. Just saying that, so we're careful.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, this is just the beginning of a conversation that we'll gather our resources and really go back and figure out what the right things to do are for our state. I'm just glad that we're talking about it. It's very important. Oh, Jim, I think you're on mute. I think you're trying to say something.
I'm okay. I think I'm talking to myself.
Oh, sorry, we missed it. I would like to thank the subcommittee for all their hard work. These regulations are so important. And so thank you for taking a look at them in the subcommittee, and also for taking the time to review them now. So thank you so much. It's very important.
Yes.
Are we done with these for now?
Yes. So what I will do is I will take these list of recommended changes, and they will be forwarded to the board. Other advisory committees are either finishing their recommendations or have finished with recommendations they're also submitting to the board. So I think the next step for the board would be probably at the March meeting, if their time allows, to start to review these, to look to see if there's any changes that can be consistent across the professions, or if there's any items where the board might have questions, where they would want some follow-up comments from the advisory committees. As best as I'm able, and Laura as well, we'll go ahead and relay the comments to the advisory committees. But there could be items that maybe another advisory committee had brought up that they want to get some input from the other advisory committees to discuss. But the plan, I think, this year is for the board to really look at these changes, and then by the end of this year to go ahead and submit those changes across the professions. So that'll be the next step going forward.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am also paying attention to time and how time flies. So we will need to make decisions about what we do for the rest of our agenda.
Yes. Yeah, I think the training that's coming up in new business, just to make sure we have enough time to cover those topics, we'll probably have to move to the next meeting. But so I think we just keep on the current agenda. We'll probably just get as much done as we can, if that's okay with you, Laura.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, discussion of care of clients in crisis.
Okay, so this item is an item that's been referred by the board to the advisory committees. There has been a discussion about certain individuals maybe in a time of crisis after hours, and what is the responsibility of the practitioner in order to make sure that they are connected to appropriate services after hours. And what is the role of the licensee in terms of making sure that there are, in terms of any kind of messages that they would set up for clients, is it sufficient for a licensee to say, if you're in a time of crisis, call 911, or with the new rollout of the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, is it sufficient to say, call 911 or call 988, or do you need to have more of a formal arrangement in place? And then what a lot of the advisory committees have been discussing is whether there is language in their unprofessional conduct regulations that can be modified to address this issue, or whether there needs to be some new language to discuss and forward back to the board. And so one item on this point that I looked through the unprofessional conduct for your profession. And again, this is AR 102-3-12A that we just were talking about. And under item number 40, it states that it's unprofessional conduct, failing to seek continuation of care or abandoning or neglecting a client under or in need of professional care without making reasonable arrangements for that care. And I think how this has been interpreted in the past really has more to do with ceasing care and transferring them or making sure that they have services after you have terminated a relationship with the client or while you're going through that process. But in terms of continuation of care, it's also possible that that could be looked at as you provide services because your office is open to a certain time, and then what is your responsibility after that? So this is one item that I was reviewing your professional conduct regulations. I looked that this might be the closest item to this topic, but it does not mean that that has to be the way that your advisory committee addresses it. But I think it's important for your advisory committee to discuss this topic and then to discuss if there's any specific language you would like to refer back to the board for your profession to clarify the role of the practitioner, and then to clarify, what's the standard for individuals in this profession concerning care of clients who are in crisis after hours, or referral of those clients to different services as well. And Laura, I tried to summarize that as best from the board meetings. Do you have any other comments about that in terms of what the board discussed on that issue, or Jim?
No, I do not. I mean, I know every discipline is talking about how to handle it, but no, I think you've summarized it well. It's a matter of how do we want to do it? What do we think is the right thing to do? Is this comprehensive enough? Any feedback about that?
I guess from the public member of the board, does any of the members of this committee feel or not feel that there is a professional responsibility for a patient in a time of crisis to have an option other than calling 911 or 988? I guess that's a fundamental question.
I would say as a person in private practice, sometimes it comes down to that. If it's 4 a.m. and I don't hear my phone, or, that is the ultimate default. But I have a conversation with every one of my clients about what would their plan be if they were in crisis and they could not reach me, so I talk about it directly with each one of my clients, but it's, it is assumed that 911 or 988 is going to be there.
I think you also have to consider, what does the community have to offer, which that client is in, and talk about those community services in terms of a crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the tough part there. I mean, Jim, I appreciate the question. I think it's a legitimate one. I say yes. I think that we do think, at least I would think, that there's responsibility we have. The question is what within the mental health realm do we have access to? Up here,
Right.
I'm in Olathe, I have RSI, which supports Johnson County, Wyandotte County, Douglas County. And so I give all my clients It's 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365. They can walk into, it's not a hospital, right? Not going to an emergency department. If there's a need that they have that's not urgent or emergent that would warrant a hospital visit, they could go to RSI, or they could call even. They can speak to anybody through RSI, which is a local service, and touch base with them. And if they need to come in to get talked to, evaluated, whatever, they could do that without walking into Advent Health or Cottonwood Springs or something like that. Because I do think that for many of our folks with mental health issues, calling 911 or going to the emergency department aren't always the best options for them. Now here in our area, we have co-responders that'll come out that are mental health folks that'll respond with the police department. Not every place in Kansas has mental health co-responders that are going to come out with the police officers to assess a person on a mental health call. So we know that what can happen when law enforcement has limited options, what they can do if they get called out to something. Hospital ER departments are overwhelmed with mental health people showing up and not having anywhere for them to go. And so I think the issue, though, is what options. I've looked at options for my practice specifically, and is it even financially possible for me to have a service that covers me 24 hours? So I have availability. I have RSI that I refer people to. I've called RSI to make sure the numbers are working, talk to people there. I have 988, I have 911, I have all the different things. But when it comes to having like an after hours clinician for a small private practice, I don't know how that works either. So I was wondering what even the board's talking about is options that they've explored that people might look at. Because for us, it's really, what are our 24-hour Johnson County crisis, right? We use them, and then RSI, and then of course, ER, 911, 988. So I have a lot of options available after hours, which is probably more than I would say probably most. So I think most is 911 or go to the emergency department. But that also depends on resources that are available. You might not have any other resources in your community outside of those.
Sometimes police get called and they are ill-equipped oftentimes to deal with mental health issues.
Right.
So in smaller communities, that is what people might resort to, is contacting the police. And, we have heard all too many times where things like that have escalated into something very damaging, hurtful.
Yeah.
But I think there is responsibility, whether you're in private practice or with an agency, to develop a mental health advanced directive with every client based on what you have available in your community.
Yeah.
What we have in Johnson County will be much different than, say, a Greenwood County or Butler County or whatever. But I think there is that responsibility to have that advanced directive of what do you want me to do if you become suicidal or whatever.
Is that something, Michael, that you think exists in practices throughout Kansas, or is?
Well, in like community mental health centers, that's becoming very popular. When we do our evaluations of new clients, we do an advanced directive with them. So they tell us, who do you want us to contact in a time of crisis? Which, if we have to go hospitalization, what is your view of hospitalization? That type of stuff. Yeah. How do you want me to respond if you have a psychotic break? All those type of things. So that's something that we've started doing, just so the practitioner knows exactly what direction to go if that comes up.
Does everybody else do that? Does every other practice do something like that, an advanced directive? I like that concept.
I think it's going that direction, but I don't think everybody does that.
I would say.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I would say no. I'd say most folks that are their individual sole proprietors in practice are likely not doing those things.
Yeah, I agree.
If you have a larger group practice, because of the responsibilities, especially if you're incorporated, possibly, I don't know, you're going to have more of that. But when you have some like individual providers get together as a group practice, and I will say that in our informed consent, we're supposed to talk about what to do after hours, right? I mean, that's supposed to be a conversation that each clinician has with their clients is, when am I available? How can you get a hold of me? What to do in case of an emergency? But most people's what to do in the case of an emergency is 911 or emergency department. And you'll hear that on most people's voicemails too. And again, I think the questions being asked is there a responsibility for providers to have something for their clients outside of those things? Even Michael's talking about some excellent work regarding the advanced directives piece, that he's getting very specific information. Like I'll ask, what's your preference? Like if we need to deal with getting to the hospital, what's your preference? Ambulance, have somebody come get you? Like how do we deal with those things? But when it comes to what happens after hours, I think the question is, should we have more available after hours for people to do or to contact? Should we, almost like a doctor's office, are we supposed to have a 24-hour answering service that if someone needs something, they can call the office and talk to somebody that's not you? I think that's being asked as the question's being asked. I don't know if that's a possibility within our realm to be able to offer those things. They're not necessarily as developed for us as they are for medicine. And also the cost associated with those things would probably put a lot of folks out of business. So I think things such as the advanced directives, better work in that regard, and training people to actually follow through with the things they're supposed to do would be a next step. But I think we all have a responsibility. It's how well have we prepared people for what happens outside the hours of whatever business hours are, and then what's available in your community. But I think something needs to be done, because 911 and 988, I don't know necessarily is always best for what the person's needs may be. So, but again, you're kind of hamstrung by what's available in your community.
Well, there's certainly a huge variation based on, different parts of Kansas, but I love the idea of the mental health directive. It's just a conversation. It can be tailor-made to every community, every practice. I really like the idea of that. And we get to decide if we want to make that part of what we require.
I think, Laura, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but if I am, correct me, but I think what the board is looking for is a recommendation from this group as to what should or shouldn't be a position to provide either Michael's after hours directive. I think that to document that, so you can document it by patient, by county, because we all know that depending upon where you live, it varies the services greatly.
Sure.
But some type of piece of information that a patient can then share with his or her support team, whether it's family or friends, someone who knows what am I going to do? This is the list, because I'm going to go on a limb here and say that when you're in crisis, you're not really thinking about all that stuff.
Needs to be pre-planned. Absolutely. I'd be happy to take a motion, a request to take that back to the board and initiate that conversation on a board level. Do I have a motion?
Acha wanted to say something up there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just briefly. Mike, I really like that your document. If you can share that document, I would like to have it, because I think the advanced directive is a good way to do it. And I think Andrew talked about putting it in the informed consent. I think having something in the informed consent that covers you is important. But the nature of what we do by nature is more outpatient. What we do as counselors is not inpatient work. And so there are certain things we cannot do. Some things that I would call it outside the scope of what we do. And so that's why we have to be very careful here. Like I think somebody said, if we take this and try to put it on counselors, it's going to put some people out of business completely. So that's why, if we are looking at it more as we are serving as people on an outpatient basis, then the advanced directive is what I think perhaps works best. So, Michael, thank you. I would like to get that document. Maybe we can take and study it and see how can we make it, narrow it so that it's a lot more counselors can use a document like that. That's what I would say, because otherwise, we work as with people on an outpatient basis. There's no way to completely cover that. Yes, the services that are going to get through 911 are going to be not as effective, but at least that's something. Anyway, just let me leave it at that.
Thank you. Michael, will you send that to David and to me, and we'll get that out to everybody on the committee?
Yeah, can you specify again for me what you're asking?
Oh, the mental health directive. Would like to take a look at what the document that you use as a starting place for
As a
something we
guideline?
can create.
Yep, I can send something to you.
Thank you so much. And we'll get that out to everyone. And David, do we need a motion for me to take to the board a request to have this considered from the disciplines and on a state level?
Either a motion, or if it's just the consensus of the advisory committee to forward it to the board, a motion is always cleaner, so.
Let's do a motion then, just so we have it.
So moved.
Jim?
I move that you take it to the board to address the issue of an advanced directive,
Thank you.
informed consent.
Jim, would you like to second that? Okay, that was a yes. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thanks. This is very important. So we will start the process. Thank you for that. All right, David Fye, we don't have any time left, do we? We have 5 minutes.
No, we're just about out of time.
Mm.
So maybe instead of starting to look into one of these topics, maybe it'd be best to just go ahead and save them for the next meeting.
I think so too.
I have a question. What was the guest speakers? Did we have guest speakers for today, or what was that? I can't remember.
So part of on the agenda, one of the discussion points under item C was to talk about different topics that the advisory committee would like to discuss for the next year. And as part of that conversation, if there's individuals you think would be helpful to come and speak to the advisory committee, occasionally groups do request to make public comment, but we could be proactive and reach out if there's any groups or individuals you think would be helpful to bring ideas or to comment on certain topics. That's something that the advisory committee could do. So.
Could be thinking about that. Okay, so I guess is it time to adjourn? Is there anything else we need to talk about before we adjourn?
The next meeting would be on Monday, April 3rd at 10 a.m. But aside from that, I don't know if there's any other items that we really need to take care of today. We can just carry those forward to the next meeting.
Great, and we should have time. So thank you so much, everyone, for all your intense discussion about these important topics. I need a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Second.
Second, okay, Bob, thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
No opposed, I assume. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.